I suppose in everyone's life there is an event which at the time seems insignificant, but turns out to be very important for personal and professional reasons. I suppose we'd call it serendipity. In my case, it was the decision to attend the 1952 International Congress of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics in Istanbul. I was at the time a graduate student of Sir Geoffrey Ingram Taylor, better known as G.I. Taylor, in Cambridge, and decided to go to Istanbul to give a talk on the work we had been doing. Now, that Congress was organized by William Freiberger, who, before becoming founder of the Division of Applied Mathematics, was a professor in Istanbul. He was very, he not only brought, he also brought to Istanbul a group of senior members of the faculty of the division, and some of them heard my lectures, my paper in Istanbul, especially Erastus Lee, who was actually by then chairman of the division at Brown. And after returning to Cambridge and then to Australia, to Melbourne, to resume my position as senior scientific officer at the Division of Aeronautics of CSIR, I received a letter from Freiberger inviting me to join him at Brown as a research associate. I found that very exciting, and I accepted it with alacrity, although it implied quite a reduction in my salary. But I was free and unmarried and got a Fulbright fellowship for the voyage there, and assumed that position in sometime 1955, working with Freiberger on problems in elasticity, plasticity, fluid mechanics, and altogether continuum mechanics. Now, not long after starting to work with him, perhaps 6 months or a year, Freiberger asked me, "Walter, we are getting a computer at Brown in the division. How would you like to look after it?" And that sort of changed my interests in mathematics. And I was very keen to do that because I'd known about computers from Cambridge, where I attended lectures on the EDSAC. So Freiberger arranged for me to go to New York, to IBM, to what was called the Watson Lab at Columbia, to learn about programming the computers we were about to get. The CPC, card programmed electronic calculator, which wasn't a real von Neumann computer, and the IBM 650, which was one. And later on, he also arranged for me to spend the summer, or a few weeks, with IBM at World Headquarters in New York, Madison Avenue, which no longer exists, I think. IBM had a program for junior faculty members to acquaint them with computers, and particularly with IBM. And that was a very interesting few weeks. I learned to program the IBM 401. I think it was 401. And I spent also some time with a group constructing the new Fortran system, the Fortran language, led by Bacchus and Dave Sayre, and which enabled me, coming back to Brown, to give one of the first lectures anywhere on Fortran. So I went back to Brown and taught some courses on numerical analysis and Fortran. And also, as it happened that year, I met my future wife, a 19-year-old biology undergraduate at Brown, Christine Holmberg, and we got married later that year, which was one of the fortunate coincidences. But before going on with what happened in computing, let me tell you also that later in the 50s, Brown had, the division had always had very good relationships with Bell Labs. And the director of the mathematics department of Bell Labs, John Lewis, always was very happy with the way we trained our graduate students, of whom they took quite a few. But he always said that they weren't very well prepared in mathematical statistics. So Lewis suggested that if we could find a first-class mathematical statistician, they would pay his salary for a year or so and also make him a consultant to the labs, which was a very attractive position. So Prager looked around the world. He knew everyone in the mathematical sciences and found that there was in Stockholm a young docent, Ulf Grenander, who had been a star student of Harald Cramer's and written a rather remarkable thesis for him, who found it difficult, like everyone in Scandinavia, to find a chair. So he thought that he might be interested. And indeed, Grenander was interested and came to Brown, to the division, must have been about 1958 or so, and gave what became a very popular course in mathematical statistics, which was attended actually by a good many of the Brown applied math faculty, including me, and but based actually on Harald Cramer's famous textbook on mathematical statistics, which he had written during the war in longhand. And somehow Ulf and I hit it off, and we did some interesting work on time series analysis, spectral analysis of time series, and the beginnings of his pattern theory. Now, back to computing then. Towards the end of the 50s, Tom Watson, Jr., the son of the founder of IBM, decided he'd like to give Brown a computer center, build a computer center for us, which we didn't have. There were very few in the country. So the senior fellow of Brown, John Nicholas Brown, of the Brown family, who persuaded Philip Johnson, the distinguished architect of the New York State Theater, for instance, in New York City, to design the building. I think Philip Johnson thought it would be a good idea to have good relationships with IBM. They may have more commissions. So Philip Johnson, I walked around with him, and he asked me, what on earth is a computer center? And so he designed a lovely building, a two-story building. But when he told Watson the price, which was $1 million, Watson said, "I'm sorry, I haven't got that kind of money," which is, of course, rather strange. So Johnson went back to the drawing board and designed, and Watson said, "What I want is a little jewel." So Johnson went back to the drawing board and designed what really became a little jewel, which still stands there as a kind of computer center, very well kept up, which only cost $300,000. Having that building, then we decided to go and try to get a computer for it. So I went to New York, to Washington, to the National Science Foundation, and we got a grant of what, I think $700,000 to buy the latest IBM computer. It turned out to be an IBM 770, which was not the usual sort of scientific computer, but it was a very fine computer, and also a 1401, which kept us going until the 360 system came along. At that time, I decided, Ulf Grunander had to return to Sweden. Harald Kramer could stay on as director of the Center for Insurance Mathematics and Mathematical Statistics whilst being president of Stockholm University. But then around 1958, 1960 probably, the King of Sweden appointed him as president of all the Swedish universities. And that made it impossible for him to stay on as director. So Kramer, of course, invited Ulf, his star student, to come back to Sweden and take over that position. This was quite an honor for Ulf. He was only in his 30s, and he couldn't very well refuse that, not that he had wanted to. So Ulf went back to Sweden and invited me to come and join him in Stockholm in 1962 to do some work with him. And so I got a Guggenheim Fellowship to go to Stockholm with my wife, Christine, and our then 5-year-old son, Christopher, and I worked with Ulf on a very interesting long paper on weather forecasting, actually, which was quite original, taking account the randomness of observations, and became quite well known. But so I stayed there for a year or so, a wonderful time. But what was really extraordinary during that year was the upheaval that took place at the Brown Division in applied mathematics at Brown during that academic year, 1962-63. It was a great time for me to be in Sweden because through Kramer's good offices, Christine and I were invited to the Nobel banquet. It was quite an occasion, and the prize winners were particularly interesting. The prize for physiology and medicine was given to Watson, Crick, and Crick for the work on the double helix model for DNA. And I had actually been a contemporary of Watson's at Clare College, Cambridge. So, and the prize for literature was given to John Steinbeck, whom Christine knew from Long Island. Her father, who was a surgeon at Southampton Hospital and lived in Sag Harbor, was John Steinbeck's doctor. So Steinbeck was very surprised when Christine came up to him and said hello. So now I was going to say what was happening at that time, that year at Brown, which was rather in the division. Res Lee had handed over the chairmanship to Ronald Rivlin. Res was a very distinguished English, Cambridge-educated applied mathematician who was very easygoing, and he said, well, if Ronald wants it, he can have it. So Ronald became chairman, but he made himself very unpopular with the rest of the faculty. And the rest of the faculty went to Prague to get his support in getting rid of Rivlin. Very unwisely, Prague acceded to that and brought a group of people to see the president, Barnaby Keeney, and sort of gave Keeney an ultimatum to get rid of Rivlin or else. Well, anyone who knew Keeney would have known that giving an ultimatum to Keeney was not a very clever thing to do. So Keeney turned around and said, I don't accept ultimatums. In the contrary, I think that's half a dozen people, you don't really have a future at Brown. Why don't you find yourself other jobs? Something that would be quite impossible these days. But it happened. About half a dozen of the most senior members of the department left Brown and joined other distinguished universities. They were all distinguished people. Quite a couple of them became members of the National Academy. And Prague felt he had to leave too. Not that actually I think Keeney told him to leave, but I think what happened was that Keeney went to Watson and asked him, can't you find a job for Prague for a couple of years or so at IBM? And that's what Watson did. He had Prague appointed as sort of IBM's roving ambassador to European universities, for which Prague was ideally suited because he spoke all the languages, he knew everyone, he was a member of several academies. So Prague left too. So Brown was, the division was practically denuded of all its distinguished faculty members in continuum mechanics. What Keeney did then was appoint Rowan Truell, a member of the division, as chairman. Now, Rowan was a wonderful person, one of Christine and mine best friends, a Republican, a member of the establishment at Brown in Providence, member of the Hope Club, and a very distinguished physicist, more than applied mathematician. He was running what was called the metals lab, which was somewhat separate from the division, although part of it. So Keeney told Rowan, you have to build up the division again. And here's another serendipity. Rowan Truell had been at Cornell with Joe LaSalle, who was leading a mathematics group, a very distinguished mathematics group at the Martin Marietta Company. And Rowan knew that the group wasn't very happy there in an industrial member of an industrial company, although they had a lot of freedom. A really distinguished group, which was really sort of led by Solomon Lefschetz, I think part-time, because Lefschetz was at Princeton. So Rowan persuaded Joe LaSalle to bring his whole group to Brown, and persuaded Keeney to accept it, also something that would be impossible these days. So the whole group, except for one person whose name I forget, who went to Florida, came lock, stock, and barrel to Brown, all very distinguished people. The only one who is still around is Harold Kushner, also retired. So Brown, the applied math division, changed from being a very distinguished group in continuum mechanics to become a very distinguished group in dynamical systems, an enormous coincidence. And in a way, it was rather a good thing, because the kind of mechanics that the division was well known for before became really part of engineering rather than applied mathematics. And dynamical systems, differential equations, really became much more fashionable and much more pure mathematics but really more appropriate for applied mathematics. So that's what happened. The applied mathematics stayed very well known. People didn't sort of realize, I think, outside that change had taken place, but they just knew it kept on being very distinguished. Another thing that Keeney asked Rontrul to do was to try and get Grenander back. Now, when Grenander left for Sweden, it was really for a permanent position. So the division looked around for a replacement. We interviewed several people, Jeff Watson, Hammersley, but we decided on Murray Rosenblatt, who was not happy at Indiana and had actually been a collaborator of Grenander's on a book on time series analysis. But Murray Rosenblatt was also one of those people who went to Keeney and so also had to leave. And he left for San Diego. So Rontrul, so the task was now to get Grenander back to Brown. First he came by himself for 6 months, and somewhat later he brought his family and on a visit. But by the end of the visit, he sort of put the question before his family, would you like to stay at Brown or would you like to go back to Sweden? And they decided to stay. And that's how Grenander stayed at Brown. And it was very nice for me because I kept on collaborating with him on mathematical statistics and on the early papers on pattern theory, which I had become managing editor of the Quarterly of Applied Mathematics when Freiberger left in '65, and was very happy to publish the first papers on pattern theory in the Quarterly. Now, in the meantime, because Freiberger had left, I became director of the Computer Center, which I did in addition to my work in the division, teaching and research in the division. But it became a little too burdensome, really, to run the center. So in the early 70s, I gave it up and handed it over to my associate director. In the meantime, I'd also arranged to hire Andy Van Dam because I felt we needed a real computer scientist, someone who really knew software. And Andy Van Dam had come from University of Pennsylvania and was a pioneer in computer graphics and built up the computer science group. When I became chairman of the Division of Applied Mathematics in '72, we decided, in addition, with the help of the provost, Murray Glicksman, that it was really a time for computer science to split off from applied mathematics. We knew that was going to grow faster than applied mathematics, and we didn't want the tail wagging the dog. So we split, although some people thought we should change the name of the division to Division of Applied Mathematics and Computer Science. But on the whole, that was not a good idea. So we split it off. It became its own department. Andy Van Dam became the first chairman, and it has now become a very distinguished department. When I became chairman, I tried to sort of keep up with some aspects of computer science. And one of the more interesting things I did during my chairmanship was to hire Stu Gieman. with the help of Grenander. Now, Stu actually started his work in medicine at MIT, but changed to mathematics, to applied mathematics, and was very anxious to come to Brown and work with Grenander. This was a very difficult time in applied mathematics in Brown University on the whole. The late 70s, Carter was president, and the it was not just inflation, but the economic situation in the country was very bad, and the Brown was really cutting down on expenditures, and it was very difficult to hire new people. So Stu came at a remarkably low salary because he wanted to work with Grenander, and became, of course, one of our most distinguished faculty members, building up his field very successfully. I gave up the chairmanship in 1982 and went back to mainly doing mathematical statistics with Ulf, and also got a joint appointment in the medical school, in the department of statistics in the medical school, and did some work with medical researchers on medical statistics. One of the shortcomings of Brown in those days was that he didn't really have a good statistics department. Of course, Ulf was a wonderful member. Ulf Grenander was a wonderful member of the division, but his interests had really strayed from mathematical statistics to other fields. But so some people in the medical school, Constantine, were interested in having a statistics department more interested in medical problems. So we founded the Center for Statistical Sciences and eventually hired Constantine Gatsonis, a very distinguished statistician, to head it. And that is really a member of the medical school. And since the medical school found the money to support it, and is now one of the most distinguished departments in the university.